Welcome to Making Capitalism Sustainable on TrueChat. Reasoned solutions to economic and educational issues facing the nation. From the CED studios in Washington, D.C., here's your host.
Welcome and thank you for tuning in to Making Capitalism Sustainable. I'm your guest host, Justin T. Weller from the State of Us podcast. We're going to be talking about immigration reform and why it is such a challenging issue to talk about in this country. And for that, we're joined by Joe Minarik of CED, their Senior Vice President and Director of Research. Joe was the Chief Economist of the Office of Management and Budget for the 8 years of the Clinton administration, and so, naturally, he's an expert on the economic impact on a variety of issues. Joe, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Justin. Good to talk to you.
We're excited to get the conversation underway. We're also joined, we've brought Lance Jackson over from the State of Us as well, and he's the senior historian here at TrueChat. So thanks for being on, Lance.
Glad to be here.
With that, we'll get underway. Immigration is definitely on the minds of Americans, and our goal is to examine whether there is a problem and how we might go about solving it. So starting with that, Joe, is there an immigration problem in this country? And if so, tell us a little bit about why we think that problem exists.
Justin, I'd probably say that we have a serious issue with immigration in really two respects. One is, of course, we have a number of Americans who are extremely unhappy about immigration. That attitude is polarized, as is often the case in important issues in the United States at this time. So we have some folks who are very much upset that immigration is too high. We have groups of people in this country, including past immigrants, including people from native-born Americans who believe that immigration is an important ingredient in our nation's success, who feel very differently. Beyond that, we have a demographic issue facing the country, of which immigration is an important component. We have a very slow-growing labor force these days, much slower than was the case 30, 40 years ago. We have a baby boom generation which is retiring. We have an older generation of Americans who are living longer. And as a result, we need workers to keep this economy going. One way to make the workforce grow faster is to accept faster immigration. There are particular categories of work where immigrants are a very important part of the workforce. And so we need to deal with really all of those issues simultaneously. And it's in a time of very hostile political dialogue. That's going to be difficult.
What you just said could be said in almost any time period of American history, could it not? I mean, as it going all the way back when we brought in laborers back when we were British colonies in early United States, and the Chinese coming in and Japanese coming in on the West Coast in the 50s and 60s, and then the Irish coming in the 1840s. So I think it's a recurring issue that is what makes this so interesting, is that you can pick out on almost any time period of U.S. history, and immigration has been a hot button issue.
Absolutely. And Lance, you're more knowledgeable about this from a broad historical perspective than I am, but I find myself looking at the calendar and remembering that my grandparents came to this country from Central Europe, from what is now the Slovak Republic, almost exactly 100 years ago. And there are family stories about how they were greeted with a considerable degree of hostility at that time. They didn't know the language. They kept in groups with people from the same part of the world. And they had a very difficult time assimilating in this country as well. So you're absolutely right. And I think it's part of what we need to understand as a nation to be able to move forward.
I couldn't agree more.
So I think the next thing that kind of comes to mind is, as we've highlighted, it's an item that's been at the center of our national debate for some time. And it's become very politicized in respect to everybody, as you had said, Joe, having very strong opinions about this. But part of making capitalism sustainable and its place here on the TrueChat network is that goal of having an honest and open conversation. And that's really, I think, what we're asking our listeners to do today as they consider some of these recommendations that CED has, as they re-examine maybe their own position on immigration. It's so important that we try to keep an open mind and approach this from a factual and informed stance so that we can arrive at hopefully the best solution. And with that, I know CED's done extensive work on immigration. It's one of your core policy areas. So can you tell us a little bit about what your most recent report on immigration addresses?
We have some serious problems in our workforce, as I alluded to a moment ago, with a falling birth rate, which means that we're having fewer children as if you start from the native-born population. And we have a growing population of elderly who are going to be collecting Social Security benefits, are going to be getting their health care from Medicare. We need folks in the workforce to be producing the goods that those elderly need, and also to be generating the incomes that provide the tax base for the Social Security and Medicare programs. What we find is that there are aspects of our workforce policies and our immigration policies that are really poorly acclimated, poorly directed towards trying to address that problem. Let me give you just one example. We have national quotas for the number of immigrants who can come into the country in any given year. We have a targeted policy called H-1B visas, which are aimed at people who want to work in occupations where we are short of workers. The H-1B visa program is restricted to fields of work where most workers have college degrees. You don't need a college degree to work as a nurse. Therefore, we have a national quota problem. We have an H-1B program that's supposed to fix it. The H-1B program is specifically designed not to deal with this problem we have with the shortage of nurses in the United States. It's one example of how our system needs to be corrected. And this is one of the things that we recommend to deal with a very specific problem in our workforce in these times of difficult demographic change.
And that quota system that you speak of, historically, we've adapted it and changed it to our needs. So should it not be that hard for us to do if we can just find some agreement?
Lance, I think you're absolutely right. And that's getting to the issue of immigration as a really hot button issue in this country. We can get to the point with issues like immigration where you have adversaries who are coming from very, very different directions. And both sides will take the position that I want to get my proposed answer. I am not interested in compromising. You can also get to the point sometimes where one side or another is so afraid of the possibility that a legislative debate is going to go 100% wrong for them, that they would rather have no change than risk a legislative process that might go against them. And in this environment in Washington, with the degree of logjam that we have in our process, it is much easier to prevent something from happening than it is to make something happen. And in this field of immigration, we can expect that one side of the debate, if it looks like it's going to lose and it looks like the other side is not willing to compromise to any degree, One side is going to try to stop action. And stopping things from happening in Washington these days is absolutely the easiest thing you can do.
It sounds like, Joe, if it's fair to sum it up as saying, one, we've got some issues with the way current regulations are. There's some things that prevent useful immigration. And then we also have to look at adding or creating some new solutions to address the concerns that Americans have today. Lance and I think, have talked at length before about we need common sense immigration. And it's not only things like nurses and professionals, it's also a lot of times, and I think I read this in CED's report in your words, it's also, there's a lot of jobs that Americans either can't do, because we don't have the people who are qualified or enough of them, or they're the jobs that Americans are unwilling to do. Lance and I talked about on the State of Us a week or two ago, that there's been a lot of reporting coming out of California with all this food that's going to go to waste because the typical migrant worker population has been significantly reduced, and that's going to affect the bottom line for a lot of Americans on their food costs. So it's I think part of the problem is we take this issue and we boil it down to these really simple, talking points that politicians and media talking heads can grab onto and say, well, this is what's wrong, or that's what's wrong, or if we do this, it'll all be great. And so often, as you had said, people get latched on to these and they don't consider that there's a bigger effect by anything that we do to these programs. So we have to be smart about it, but we also have to be willing to accept that we may not get exactly what we want. And with that, I kind of wonder if we could talk just a little bit more about some of these policy proposals and just get a better understanding, Lance and I, and hopefully those of you at home, of what they mean. But before we do that, I did want to take a moment and remind everybody that the reason that Making Capitalism Sustainable is talking about this is because the Committee for Economic Development is a nonprofit and nonpartisan business-led public policy organization that's goal really is to deliver well-researched analysis and reasoned solutions to our nation's most critical issues. And it's no surprise that immigration is one of those. Making Capitalism Sustainable is part of the TrueChat network, whose collective mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. We always want to know if you have ethical concerns with today's episode, because it's your job, the people, to keep the media responsible. So you can email ethics@truechat.org if you have a objection that you'd like to voice. Don't forget also to engage both with CED and TrueChat. You can tweet at TrueChatORG or at CED Update, and you can follow both organizations on social media so you can stay up to date on all the latest information across multiple topic areas. With that, we're returning to our conversation. We're talking with Joe Minarik and Lance Jackson about immigration and whether or not there is a problem, which we've established that there is. And now we're going to look at how we might address that problem, what we can do to solve it. So the first one that we're going to look at, and there's a list of several here, is employing native-born workers and immigrants to flexibly address looming labor shortages. I think we've sort of already addressed this unintentionally. We did a show with Cindy Cisneros from CED, and we talked about how it's one way, but there's a greater number of solutions that have to be put in place for labor concerns, including retraining workers. So we're going to skip and kind of move on here to number 2, which is remove the annual per country caps on permanent employment-based immigration visas. Now, you talked about this already briefly, Joe, but could you expand on it a little bit more and talk about, so we remove those caps. Why were they put there in the first place? And are those concerns still valid? If so, how do we address them once we've removed this?
The original concern for per country caps, and I'd be interested in Lance's reaction and his insights on this as well, but there was a concern that we would have one or two countries dominating immigration into the United States, and that other nations' people would have no chance to immigrate. And for those in this country already who had relationships back home, they wanted to be sure that the ability of their former countrymen to enter the United States and take advantage of the opportunity that's here would not be eliminated through the possible domination of one or two countries for the immigration process. The problem that we have today is that to some extent, those national quotas are running afoul of our employment needs, as in the example of nurses, and as a result, that the national caps get us in trouble with respect to building the workforce. So if we move away from national caps, we have to understand the needs of foreign national immigrants in the United States already. They are going to want to maintain ties and have a bridge to the United States for their family members. We have to respect that. But at the same time, what we need, and we've talked about this a little bit so far, is to identify occupational skills that we in the United States with native-born workers are not fulfilling, and to make available immigration opportunities for people who are prepared to come to this country and already have the skills to work in those particular occupations. That is probably one of the most important things that we could do to address the nation's economic needs with respect to immigration.
And you're totally right. It had to do with obviously racial or ethnic ideas that people had in the country and not wanting to bring in too many air quotes here, foreigners, like you said, your grandparents coming into the country and not knowing English. That was a lot of the pushback. But now we're in a situation where it's not just numbers that we need as far as workers, but like you're stressing, we need particularly skilled workers. And that's why the quota system as it reads now is sort of outdated, because we're not just looking at general population. We need specific types of workers coming in to fill most of these needs, correct?
I think that's exactly right. And we, as a country, need to get off the dime in making changes in policy here in Washington to sit down and work out the issues that we have and the potential conflicts between national quotas and having sufficient immigration flows in occupational categories where we in the United States are deficient.
So the third policy point here that CED is recommending is to move away from educational attainment as the dominant criteria to determine employment-based visas. And I like the description here. While it's brief, it points out that even though education is important, it should be only one of the measures that levels the contribution an immigrant can make to the labor market. And I think part of where we get caught up too with education, is people have a fairly narrow idea of what education is. And Lance, having been an educator, I'm sure can speak to, there's a lot of learning that takes place in many different ways. And sometimes too, I wonder, the way that we gauge people's education from a foreign country, we sometimes forget that they may learn differently and they might have experiences that have taught them things that we might not have. So always measuring it off of that very traditional, what is your educational attainment, might not be the best long-range plan. I know that's a little off of exactly the direction that CED is taking, but maybe, Joe, you can react to that and tell us a little bit more about this third point here.
There are really a number of perspectives on the capacity of a prospective immigrant to contribute to this country. There's formal education. There's learning on the job. Somebody who works in a relatively low educational category, occupation, who has experience, is also prospectively an important employee in the United States. So we have to look really across all of those capabilities and do a much better job of that than we have thus far.
And I think that speaks to the next point as well, the streamline the visa administration process for in-demand workers. That's number 4. And number 5, use temporary employment-based visas to fill truly temporary needs. So these, 3 points here all kind of focus on the visa aspect. And it makes sense, right? I mean, if you need seasonal workers for something, or if it is a temporary demand, that process can be streamlined over longer term visas that may need more criteria to be examined and to look at. So speak a little bit, Joe. The 6th point here is create state and locally administered employment-based visas. Now that one's kind of intriguing to me. So talk to us about how would that work and how would that be coordinated with the federal visa program?
We would give state and local government leaders the opportunity to take a certain number of positions and to make it their own choice as to what kinds of immigrants they would like to see. Leaders on the ground sometimes have a much better perspective of particular skills that are needed. And we need to give state and local governments the opportunity to pick up on what's needed right on the ground in their space, and to ask to have the authority to issue quotas for people who meet particular skills. We often talk about welders. If there are welders needed in a particular city, in a particular state, we ought to be able to earmark immigration opportunities for people with that skill, not necessarily college educated, not necessarily from one specific country, but people who can go to work right off the bat would be able to help that state or city to be able to grow economically because of the ability to fill those needs.
It makes perfect sense. And the last one was create standing workforce and immigration policy advisory boards to analyze and report immigration issues. I think this one's pretty straightforward as far as obviously you got to make sure that there's somebody in charge of overseeing this process and monitoring it and providing the analysis that's required to improve it or to adjust it as necessary. And with that, we kind of want to move into the important part for our listeners, which ultimately is, we touched on before, it's a very divisive issue. Do you have any suggestions on how people of differing opinions can really approach this in such a way that we might actually be able to adopt some of these great policy ideas that CED has? How do we get people to the table to talk about this?
One of the most important things we're lacking these days is leadership. It is very easy to take a divisive issue, of which immigration is obviously an example, and use it not as a problem to be solved, but rather as a political opportunity to be exploited. We need folks to reach out from positions of leadership to both sides of the issue, to bring people together, perhaps physically, perhaps in an electronic chat. I think sometimes getting people together in a room is a lot better than in the virtual forum, because it's very easy when sitting at a keyboard and looking at a screen to imagine that the people you're talking to, figuratively speaking, are all opposed to the virtues that you hold dear. A lot of times when you're sitting down with people, you can see that they are human beings with the same kinds of needs and the same kinds of aspirations that you have. And having those conversations face to face can be constructive. But right now, what we don't have is the leaders who are willing to take the risk to reach out and to bring people together and to try to have a constructive conversation so that we get to know one another. That, I think, is one of the most important things that we potentially could do to try to address this issue.
Yeah, we talk about a lot the necessity of people remembering that As the quote goes, right? There's so much more that unites us than there is that divides us. And sometimes we forget that, especially in a digital forum where it's easy to forget that many of the people you're speaking with have the same aspirations and many of the same values, and they want the same thing. They want to be happy. They want to be successful. And when we remember those things, which is easier to do when you're looking at somebody, it enables us to talk in a more civilized manner and maybe give more merit to what somebody's saying and really hear them. So it's definitely a great suggestion. As far as, so how do we go about encouraging that correct kind of leadership? You can tell me, Lance and Joe, if you want to add to this. I guess mine is always, it continues to be and always has been, you have to tell people what kind of leadership you want, particularly your representatives. Contactingcongress.org is a great place to start. It makes it easy to figure out who your representative is, and then reach out to them and ask them these questions about some of CED's policy ideas, which you can find more on at CED.org. They've got everything listed there. So that's a great way to start is, ask them, would you support this kind of policy, and how can you help facilitate a respectful conversation on this issue? Lance, do you have any other suggestions for our listeners?
Well, my real concern here is, we're talking about large numbers of healthcare workers and skilled trade people. We're talking about my personal quality of life as I get older being affected. And I think that should be the driving point for the average American citizen to contact their leaders and say, we need to take care of this. Because if we don't get these skilled labor jobs or these nursing jobs or medical care jobs filled, our quality of life here in the United States is going to go down. I mean, I hate to make it sound so selfish, but maybe that would get people off the middle ground or off of, well, I just don't want this, those kinds of people, as Joe referred to them as, unhappy about immigration. Is, do you understand how your quality of life is going to be affected if we don't address this skilled worker shortage that's developing in the United States? And maybe get them then to be more online when they realize that this isn't about crime or numbers or any of those other issues that our current leadership has brought up, but this is about just the normal quality of life that we as Americans have come to expect is endangered now by this shortage of skilled workers.
Lance, I think that one of the things that we need to communicate to our leaders is exactly what you're saying, that there are multiple sides to this issue. One of the most important ones is the strength of our labor force going forward. And our leaders are probably more attuned to listening to people talking about issues like crime, which is not to belittle the crime issue. It is something that we need to deal with. We need to understand that there are perpetrators of crime who are native-born Americans, and we can talk about the need to deal with crime in a generic way. But we need to talk to our leaders. Our leaders are the ones who are supposed to have the capability to deal with a multifaceted issue, to bring the various interests together and to explain to them how it is that cooperation and compromise can be the best way to achieve everybody's needs. And if we as citizens can make it clear to our elected policymakers that we expect an informed, an intelligent, a dispassionate approach to issues like this, which are too easily politicized and turned into partisan issues, that instead we need careful thought and answers. Who knows, our leaders might at least follow what the citizens are telling them that we need. And we need to communicate how important this issue is in all those different respects. And you're exactly right. This is, in the longer term, a quality of life issue. If we do not have a strong and growing labor force, we're sunk.
And in more than one way. It's not only healthcare, obviously, as we've talked about. If you have a significant enough labor shortage, you look at broad economic implications across the board. So it's been a great conversation today. And of course, we're very thankful for Lance and Joe's participation to help us break down the issue and share some insight on the valuable work that CED has done and is continuing to do on the very important issue of immigration reform. With that, don't forget that you can learn more and get engaged with what CED is working on at ced.org. They've got lots of policy resources, a number of reports, and we encourage you to check them out and see everything they've got to offer there. You can also review all 7 policy points that I discussed and that we talked about today on the show there at their website. You can listen to TrueChat podcasts on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and more. And of course, on TrueChat's website, which is just truechat.org. For Making Capitalism Sustainable on TrueChat, broadcasting from Washington, D.C., I'm Justin T. Weller. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Making Capitalism Sustainable. Be the change.
Looking for responsible media? Listen on demand to politics, sports, and more with the TrueChat app or at truechat.org. Beyond the horizon, there is trustworthy media at TrueChat.